Still Loading podcast is brought to you by the wonderful people on Patreon. Amazing people like Gilmer, Kevin from the Bit by Bit Foundation, Matt, aka Stormageddon, Ryan K, Stephen P, and Mr. Biscuits have all been wonderful enough to support the show over there. So if you would also like to get your name read at the beginning of an episode, along with a bunch of other goodies, go over to patreon.com/stillloadingpod and check out everything it has to offer. On this episode of Still Loading, his books guided us to victory. That's a little cheesy. I want to think of something else. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new episode of the Still Loading podcast. I'm your host, Josh Koval, and today's episode, I am thrilled to welcome my guest onto the show for this one. For those of us who grew up with, especially in the PS1 and PS2 era, playing especially JRPGs or RPG games in general, you may have seen some of this man's strategy guides. He wrote a number of strategy guides for some of our favorite games: Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy VII, at least on the cover, is boasted as the best-selling strategy guide of all time. So he's got that under his belt right there. Joining me today to talk about gaming, writing guides, and anything in between is David Cassady. David, how are you doing today?
I'm all right. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you once again for, I told you off mic, I'll reiterate it on mic. Thank you once again for setting aside some time for this. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
So we'll kick this off right away. Strategy guides are a big part of everyone's, a lot of gamers' life growing up in the 90s and early 2000s. And I'm no different. I told you a brief version of it off mic. I had your Final Fantasy VIII strategy guide. I brought it to school every single day for a time when I was in the midst of my first playthrough of Final Fantasy VIII. And I think one of the reasons I actually fell in love with that game was actually your guide, because as much as I love Final Fantasy VIII, that game's a little obtuse. So having the guide for it really helped a lot. It really helped with a lot of the stuff that would have probably frustrated me had I played it without it. So it really kind of set the tone for me with that game. And I would bring it to lunch every day, and I would, look at the artwork in it, look at what the next section of the game that was coming up for me. I remember I borrowed it from a friend named Matt, and then I never gave it back to him. In fact, I still have the guide up in my up in storage, in my attic, and then I couldn't find it for a number of years. And I when I tell you, dude, I carried this everywhere for a while, some of the pages are falling apart. Like this thing got worn down. I actually had to buy another copy off of eBay a couple years ago because I couldn't find my kind of messed up one. And then I ended up finding it. So now I have two copies. But
Nice.
Yeah, so that guide was a huge part of my junior high and high school era of life. So that's where I'm coming from with this. And so I also reached out to a bunch of my community, and we want to kind of get to know a little bit more about you prior to guide writing, and then also just a lot of we have a lot of questions about the act of writing strategy guides back then. But before we get into all that, just your personal history in games. Like, how did you first get into video games? What some of your earliest gaming memories? Just kind of talk a little bit about what got you into gaming.
Sure. I've been into gaming as long as I can remember. I mean, I remember back in the late 70s and stuff, going to Pizza Hut and playing Pac-Man and Asteroids and Space Invaders and things like that. Going to the roller rink with my friends and spending all of our time plunking quarters into Frogger. Different things like that. But it's just always been a part of my life. It was the kind of thing too where my mother back in the 80s would take us to the mall and basically hand us like $2 and drop us off at the arcade. and then come back 2 hours later and pick us up because it was easier than dragging us around the mall with her. So um, it's just kind of always been a joy for me, no matter how basic it was.
Hmm.
And I, I started off playing like the Sears Pong. I don't know if you've ever seen it. It was two
I've never seen
paddles.
it in person, but I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was two paddles, and it wasn't capable of creating all of the graphics necessary for Pong. So it actually came with stickers that you Klingon stickers that you could put
Like the
on your
cellophane
TV.
stickers or whatever.
Yeah, and
Yeah, yeah.
that would create the borders for Pong, and then the only thing it actually created were the two paddles and the ball because
Okay.
it couldn't do the rest.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it was just two little dials on a set, and you sat shoulder to shoulder and played Pong. But yeah, I don't know. I've always loved video games.
I can really resonate with that. I mean, I know I'm younger than you, but the idea of just seeing something on the screen and being like holy hell, I'm controlling the image on this on the TV. I thought I could only just watch it, but now
Mhm.
I can actually control it. And I don't know if that's the same feeling you had when you first played Pong, but like for me, seeing Mario Bros was the first game I remember seeing on a CRT on an old tube television,
Mhm.
and being like, "Whoa, I'm controlling a cartoon!" Like I didn't know I could control what was on the TV. Like it really just captured my imagination.
Yeah, I've always felt, and I still kind of feel this way, that I would rather play a story where I have some impact on it than watch a story where,
Hmm.
everything's already been decided. I mean, I still like movies, I still like TV, but ultimately, I would rather play something like an RPG where I'm actually involved in the story
Hmm.
than just sit there and watch something.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm same. I love TV and movies and music and everything, but like games is really where like my heart came to be. Hence why I do this podcast and been doing it for a while now.
Sure.
But question before I move on though, what was one of your go-to arcade games?
uh, I was a huge Double Dragon fan back in the
Okay,
day. Like
okay.
I got to the point there was a grocery store near my house that had a Double Dragon machine, and it was right next to a bottle return where you could take like Coke bottles and stuff and get money. So I would go
Oh.
collect Coke bottles, drop them off there, get a few coins, and then I could play Double Dragon for a bit. And I got it down to where I could play through the entire game on 1/4 because I'd figured it out. And granted, I cheesed it a little bit and just did elbows a lot. But it was by far one of my favorite games growing up. That and also the original Punch Out back before it was Mike Tyson's Punch Out.
Oh yeah, because that was like one of the most beautiful looking arcade cabinets. Like the cabinet itself was really impressive because it didn't
Hmm.
have like a screen up top too. Like it
Yeah,
had a monitor up top,
you're
and
right.
then the graphics on that thing were insane for the time.
They were back at the time. Yes.
That's awesome. So because I normally would like pry a little bit more into like your gaming past, but I have a lot of
Hmm.
questions from my audience and from my community about your time writing guides. How
Sure.
did you trying to transition that love of gaming into writing guides? Like where did that like how did you get involved with into writing guides in the first place?
Okay. Well, this is a weird story and a little lengthy.
Go for it.
When I got out of college, it was very clear to me that I didn't want to do anything related to my major. Uh,
You have no idea how much I relate to this.
yeah,
Continue.
I think a lot of people have that experience where they go to college for something, they get out, and they're like, "Well, I don't know that I actually want to do that now." Uh, so I found myself kind of sitting there thinking, "Okay, well, if I could do absolutely anything, what would I do?" And the first thought that came to mind was I would want to be involved with video games somehow. Um, and at the time, the only thing I could think of was to go out to the mall and try to get a job at like a GameStop, but at the time it would have been like Babbage's and
Hmm.
electronics boutique and things like that. So I ended up going to every video game store I could find in the city and dropping off an application, and I mean that was a lot. Um, and ended up getting a job at an electronics boutique, which no longer exists.
Hmm.
Um, but the guy, like, he didn't even want to hire me. he he at the time, like they were making all their money off of big software suites like Office, the big
Okay.
Microsoft packages, because they were like $400 versus a
Yeah.
video game that was about $40. So he wanted
Mhm.
to sell a lot
Mhm.
of those big software. So he didn't even want to hire me. But I got in there, and then within like the next year, the entire store was taken over by video games. So that knowledge became useful.
That became much more, yeah, that was more important than the software suites.
Yeah, it was right. Genesis was out, and it was still Nintendo's NES on the market
Mhm.
um, at the time. But then the Super NES came out during that time, so you had the big console war between the two, and video games just went absolutely insane. So now, granted, I'm just talking about how I got into working at a video game job. What happened after that that got me to writing was I live in a town where there was a publisher who was not making video game guides at that time. Um, but on a weird off chance one day, I'm sitting at work and this lady comes in, wants to talk to me about video game guides. So we talked for about an hour or two about it, and she gives me a packet to fill out of just general information. She wanted to know kind of the interest, what people were buying, what was hot, what was not. So I filled out this packet, I got it back to her, and I never thought about it, again. About a year later, this guy comes back into my store, and we've actually moved at this point to a new store. But this guy comes in doing the same thing, asking me about all the video games, what's hot, what's not. And I spent like 3 hours with this guy, sold him every console, sold him a bunch of PC games, sold him a bunch of
Yeah.
games for each console. And I didn't really think of anything about it except, hey, that was a great sale.
Yeah.
uh,
That's gonna look great.
I'm like, yeah, I'm awesome. Um, but then like a month later, the guy shows back up and he's like, hey, do you remember me by any chance? I'm like, yeah. Um, and he said, I am the publisher of this company, Brady Publishing, and I'd like you to come work for us. So we sat down and talked, and
Wow.
he had no idea what he wanted me to do. He just felt that he needed somebody on his staff that knew video games because they were all book people.
Mhm.
Brady used to be like this high end computer, like they would write books about programming and things like that. They didn't do video games, but they had decided that they wanted to try to get into that, and they decided that Brady would be the imprint that would go after it. So you had all these people who were used to making programming books, and now they were going to try to make strategy guides. Um, and they didn't really know what they were going to do with that yet. When I finally joined them, they had only done like maybe 5 guides. Um,
Okay.
the first one was, well, they had done several guides on EA Sports titles that looked a lot like computer books, like,
Mhm.
programming books. They were black and white and they were super thick, and they were just very like technical.
Yes.
Um, and then some of the other guides they'd done, they weren't there yet. They weren't very impressive. So we got in the door and we just started trying to figure it out because at the time, um, companies like Sierra and some others have been making their own guides, but
Mhm.
the strategy guide, as you know it and I know it, still didn't really exist yet. Um, so it was kind of this interesting period where we were just all kind of racking our heads trying to figure out what we needed to do.
That's really interesting. So you were on the ground floor pretty much of like helping Brady Games kind of figure out their own personal stamp on what strategy guides would become.
Yeah, I mean, when I started there, I was the only person who was brought in as a video game person.
That's wild. I would never. It's one of those things, when you partake in it as a kid, you just think, oh well, these people know exactly what they're doing,
Yeah,
and and only to
we
hear
did
now
not.
is like they had no idea what the fuck they were doing.
No,
That's really
we
funny.
coming out of it, it was very much kind of it was an interesting environment because all ideas were tried, um, but they knew what they wanted to get to. They just didn't know how to get there. And the technology back at the time was not great for creating a strategy guide. Like
Hmm.
taking a screenshot was way harder back then than it is
Yep.
now.
Yep.
Recording your gameplay was way more difficult back then. Like I remember I had VCR tapes with just hours upon hours of gaming on there, and I would have to go through and try to pluck screenshots off of it.
Do you still have any of them by any
Oh
chance? Or
goodness, no.
okay.
No. That would be pretty cool, but no, I definitely do not.
There's because there's like foundations out there, like Video Game History Foundation. They would, I would almost guarantee, be interested in finding those like VHS tapes of gameplay for that was used for that. That's really crazy
Sure.
though.
Yeah.
Uh, okay, do you remember what the first guide that Brady made was, and then do you remember, like, did you work on it, and if not, do you remember what the first guide you worked on was?
I do know the first one that I worked on because that also is an interesting story. Because my publisher back at the time, we had met at like a restaurant at night and just sat down and talked about titles and what they should work on and what they shouldn't work on. And this was before I ever joined on. He just
Okay.
wanted to meet me for dinner and talk about, okay, what should Brady be doing? Um, and so I was telling him the games that were coming out that were going to be big, but I was also trying to tell him, like, this one was probably conducive to a strategy guide. This one is not. And
Okay.
one of the games I was talking to him about that was probably going to be big was virtual racing. But I
Okay.
told him that virtual racing was not a conducive to a strategy guide. There really wasn't a guide there, and it's probably not
Yeah.
something where someone would go out and buy a strategy guide. He was very sold on the idea that we should do a guide on that. So he did go ahead and go get the license for that and then wanted a guide made. And when we went out to try to find an author, naturally most of the people that wrote for us said, I don't want to do that because they're like, I wouldn't even know what to write. And I agreed.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, I don't know what anyone would write either. So we spent all this time trying to find an author, and it was getting close to the date, and we still couldn't find anyone to write it. So they came to me and said, "Hey, you're going to write this guide. Oh, and you've got 1 week to write it."
Jesus
Uh,
Christ.
yeah. So we had to make a 96-page guide in 1 week.
96 pages for Virtua Racer.
Yes, 96 pages for virtual racing in 1 week. And so I slept on my office floor for 1 week, and I called up a friend who was a big Chris Denny. He was a big racing fan, IndyCar fan. It probably still is. But I called him up. I'm like, hey, I need you to write up some basic racing strategy for me. And it doesn't have to be based on this game. I just need basic racing strategy. Something that sounds like it could apply to this game. Whether it does or not, I don't care. It just has to make sense. And he's like, sure, I can do that. I'm great. I will get you paid for this. So I worked out payment for him. He provided me with like 30 pages of text. Um,
Wow.
yeah, because he was an insane fan, so he knew what he wanted to write about. It was a good choice by me. but and then I just sat there and went through the tracks and just wrote down every single turn, how you should approach it, how you should take it, optimal speed, anything I could think of to make it the times as great as I could. Um, and we somehow got it done in the 1 week, even along with screenshots and everything else. And they published it, and that was my first guide. So
That is wild.
yeah,
What a
I
great story. I mean, it
I
sucks that you had a week from hell, but that what a great story.
yeah, I didn't go into it thinking I was ever going to write strategy guides. That was just
Yeah.
kind of how it happened. I was a technical developer essentially, where I would go in and talk with the authors and say, okay, here's what we want, here's how we want you to do it. Um, let us know how we can support you. So it was more my coming up with kind of a framework and saying this is what I want you to put together. And then they would submit text and I'd look at it and say, yeah, this is right, or let's do it a different way. Um, but yeah, it was interesting.
That's so crazy. Okay, so That's your first book. I have so
Mhm.
many different questions from my audience members. One of the questions was from listener Parallax Puddles. Also, my buddy Ryan Kern kind of elaborated on this a little bit. Like, how much of, well, there's two parts to this question, I guess. We'll start with the part that Ryan Kern wrote, where he goes, how much of what goes into a guide is a product of independent research and experience with an advanced copy of the game, and how much are the developers making sure you know what is accurate to say?
Oh, that is an interesting question. Okay, as far as what the developers provided, they provided nothing
Real
other than the game.
Same with like Final Fantasy VII and
Oh
eight,
yeah,
and really,
yeah. No, that was entirely on us to find everything. They would give us advanced copies when they could. Now, back in the day when I first started, that was easier because games were still coming out in Japan months before they came out in the U.S.
yeah.
But then they slowly started to make the releases simultaneous, which made it way harder. And then you had the games that were made in the United States that we couldn't really get a true advanced copy. Like we could get betas and alphas, but
Okay.
there were times where we would write entire chapters, get the next copy of the game, and they've completely taken out a level or they've completely redone the level, and everything we wrote was pointless. So it's it was kind of nightmarish, to be honest. There were times with some of the games that it just kept changing and changing and changing to the point where we rewrote the text 4 or 5 times.
Jesus Christ.
So, but what made like Final Fantasy VII particularly interesting was we had never done a JRPG at that point. Um,
Wow. Okay.
we had to fight. Well, I say we. I had to fight to get Brady to do that because the salespeople looked at it and said, it's a JRPG. Nobody wants those. Nobody will buy the guide. And I'm like, you're fools. People will buy this. People will want this. This is going to be huge. Um, so we fought and fought, but finally talked him into it. But we went into it having no idea what that process was going to be like. We had about 30 days to write it.
Are you serious?
Yeah, and it was I was the only writer on that particular title because again, we didn't know how big it was going to be exactly. So I was the only one writing it, and my girlfriend at the time uh, hated it because I was putting in 16-hour days, 7 days a week.
Yeah, I would. That game alone on, like, yeah, I've played Final Seven a whole bunch of times, and I
Hmm.
can beat it in about, like, if I like, I'm not a speed runner or anything like that, but I can get through the game in about 30 hours, 30 to 35. But that's because I know what I'm doing, I know where to go.
Hmm.
So to go into that blind, having to probably beat arguably like a 35 to 50 hour art like game,
Hmm.
give or take, and then also figure out secrets which the developer they gave you nothing to work off of.
They gave us a Japanese copy of the game when it first came out, so we had that. But
Could you
other than
read
that,
Japanese though?
no.
That's great.
I could not read it at all. They did eventually provide us with a strategy guide in Japanese from Japan as a resource, but again, nobody could read it
So then how did you play through that game the first time?
blindly. Very just I had to just kind of fumble through it, guess what I was doing. I had no idea what was going on in the story. Just tried to take notes on some of the things that had happened. I eventually figured out, like, okay, this is fire, this is lightning, this is, you know, this is
Yeah.
ice. Figured some of those things out, but it was not easy.
Jesus Christ. I that is So you had no that honestly, we a lot of the questions are like, how much help did you get from the devs for this? And the answer is fuck all. It's nothing. There, like,
Yeah.
that is insane. Okay, so you had 30 days to write Final Fantasy VII.
Mhm.
That alone is just bonkers to me. My buddy Try from the YouTube channel My Life in Gaming wrote asked, and this could be applied not just to Final Fantasy VII, but to pretty much any of the JRPGs that you would have written guides for. How many memory cards did you go through in the process of making the guides? The reason being is like I would assume you would have to have different save files to for reference points. Like
Right.
it's not just going through the one save file and saving over and over. I would assume you had to have like multiple saves. Did you go through multiple memory cards, or was it
Oh,
able to stay on one?
I still have a bag of memory cards from those days.
Wow.
Yeah, I have probably 50 memory cards from those days. Because yeah, every save had to be a new save because I needed to be able to go back to those saves so I could check things later. So yeah, every single save was a brand new save.
That is okay. That because that's one of those questions. I'm like, I never would have thought of that, and that it makes a lot of sense.
That's a good
Uh,
question.
Now, you obviously wrote a lot of JRPG strategy guides. Do you remember any specific side quests or like something that was like really time consuming to write to finish a guide? Like once you got through the main story, were there any side quests that stuck out to you that was like just a pain to figure out?
The different weapons at the end of Final Fantasy VII, Ultimate Weapon, Ruby Weapon, all that.
Hmm.
Um, those were nightmarish because we weren't anticipating it. So we we weren't really aware of that until we got through the game and suddenly realized, oh, this exists. And it was getting really close to publishing time where we had to send it to the printer to be able to get it out on the same day. And because that was critical, you had to have it out the exact same day. Um, but I remember we were like hours away from publishing or from going to press. And I'm still sitting there fighting Ruby Weapon, trying to figure out how the heck to beat this thing. And it was driving me absolutely nuts. I think I ended up beating Ruby Weapon with like an hour and a half to go, but
Really?
but it took me like probably a day and a half to make that happen. Of just sitting there leveling up materia, maxing out materia, making sure my levels were maxed out, all that, and trying to come up with different combinations to figure out how to work. And actually, there's there's a screenshot in the guide where I'm fighting Ruby Weapon, and I had hit something where everything was struck simultaneously, and it creates this insanely long number across the screen.
Hmm.
Um, because all the numbers are jutted together, so it looks like something like 999 billion,
Okay.
999 million, damage to the weapon. And I kept getting all of this mail from people. It's like, how did you do that? And it's like, no, guys, the max damage is 99,909. That's not possible. Um, but yeah, it that one really sticks out in my head. There was also another one that I'm trying to remember if it was 12, where there was Chocobo Racing,
Chocobo Racing
and
was in 7. I didn't play 12, so I couldn't tell you if it was also in 12.
there was one where there was supposedly a extremely low chance of getting a red Chocobo, and
Okay.
I played and played and played and could never get one to appear. So I still don't know if that was fact or fiction, but I remember playing that for days trying to just get a red Chocobo to appear, and I never got it to happen.
Now, sorry, just something that popped in my head. You mentioned like when you first got Final 7, you didn't have it was all in Japanese and there was no
Mhm.
translation. How did you end up figuring out all the names for everything if you weren't given the English translations? Did they give it to you at a later point in
We,
the writing?
right, we did eventually get it. Once they had something to give us, we did get it, and at that point, I had to just start over and start playing through the game in English. And of course, by that time, I'd already played through the game a couple of times in Japanese, just not really knowing who anybody was, um,
Hmm.
or what the different things I was using were. Uh, so it was helpful to have the Japanese game because at least prepped me, but it was kind of when we got that gold version of the game, um, it was the starter's pistol going off. It's like, okay, now everybody has to rush and
Hmm.
trying to figure that out. And it was also what was kind of interesting about Final Fantasy VII. Up to that point, you could do a lot of just taking screenshots to build maps um, and things like that. But with a 3D game like that, it wasn't possible. So we also had to figure out, okay, how are we going to guide people through this game because suddenly we can't do what we've done before. Um,
Yeah.
so we had to kind of figure that out. And if you look at the old guides, we just took different screenshots of areas and then labeled A goes to A, B goes to B.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we couldn't figure anything out. But another thing was the world map on Final
Hmm.
Fantasy VII. Again, because of the way it scrolled, we couldn't put screenshots together to make a world map, and there was no other world map in that game. So we ended up hiring an artist to go in and do an oil painting of the
What
world. Yeah, the map that's in there is a photograph of an oil painting.
is that? The thing in the like the last couple pages where
Mhm.
you see Final Fantasy VII World Map?
Yep. Yeah, that is an actual painting that still exists.
What?
One of my friends who worked at Brady still has that at his house. Yeah.
That's
It's one of a kind.
amazing.
Yeah, one of a kind painting.
That is incredible. That I have a buddy who's been on the show named Stefan Reese. I don't know. Have you ever heard of his Twitter account, Art of Nintendo Power?
I have not.
He he. I don't think he would. Your buddy would be convinced to sell it to him by any stretch. But what he does is that he actually collects pieces of the artwork that is used for Nintendo Power. You know, like if in like the first issue of Nintendo Power, you see like the clay figure of Mario
Sure.
or whatever. He has that
Nice.
physical, stuff like that. So he'll actually get the original pieces of art that's used for stuff and preserves it in like, museum quality framing and all this other stuff.
Wow.
It's wild. So when I hear this, there is an oil painting of the Final Fantasy VII world map used for the guide, that's amazing. That is absolutely so cool.
Yeah, and I mean
Um,
that's something we just had to pay for so that we could have it in the book.
yeah. Do you ever remember in writing guides, were there any things that do you remember do you remember ever being told cool things by the developers that you weren't allowed to publish? Because listener of the show, Mass Keaton, writes that he remembers there was a strategy guy that was teasing him to telling him that this specific item was a collectible, and if you found all of that specific item, something cool was happen. But the guide said it wasn't allowed, or sorry, it wasn't allowed to tell me what happened or where the other collectibles were. So, do you ever remember anything like similar like that in any of your guide writing? Now that I understand the crazy guidelines you were on, I could almost picture maybe that was just a time crunch thing. But was there ever anything that you like, whether it was something a cool thing you were told and you weren't allowed to publish, or did you ever get pushback from the developers for things written in the guides?
Yeah. Simple line, yes. Um, back if you remember Midway's games,
Hmm.
like NBA Jam, Mortal Kombat, all of those things,
Yep. Yep.
codes were big. Because having hidden codes, secrets in the game, things like that, were things that they could leak to magazines. And then
Oh,
that made the magazines, they would basically say, we will give you some of these codes, we'll leak some of these codes to you, but in return, we want a cover for our game
I see.
for that month. So they would tightly control what could go out so that they could provide those things to magazines in order to get better advertising for their games. Because to them, that's super cheap advertising,
Yeah.
um, and probably the single most effective as well. But so Midway in particular, was very tight-lipped, and there were often times where they were like, "Yeah, no, you can't put that in there because we're saving that for a later time." Um, but yeah, no, there were lots and lots of times. I don't know if anybody who had the Final Fantasy IX guide.
Oh
Um,
God. That was one of the questions. I know you didn't write that one. That was
no,
Dan Burlow,
yeah,
who wrote, or Burlew. I don't know how you pronounce his last name, but he I one of the questions I was asked by Try is how much do you know about what was about the writing of that guy? Not to throw any shade on Dan. I know the play online thing most likely was a push from Square, but just eh, if you could elaborate on that, this is an infamous guide in the community.
Dan Berlew is a fantastic guy and a great author, and he got put into an absolutely unwinnable situation with that one. I felt terrible for him. I didn't write Final Fantasy IX because I was really burnt out at the time because Square had just been cranking out titles,
Yeah, I
and
could see that.
I was writing them all, Xenogears and other things too, and I was just like, I cannot do another Final Fantasy right now. I just didn't have the stamina for it.
Yeah.
So I asked them to go ahead and pass that to somebody else, and I had no idea what I was doing to Dan at the time. That was a push because Square wanted to have a portal, which was the play
Hmm.
online thing. They wanted to have a portal that people would come to. So they wanted us to reference it and send people to their portal as much as possible. And Final Fantasy IX Strategy Guide is the result of that. And yes, we realized how bad that was,
Hmm.
and how people were going to dislike it. But unfortunately, yeah, we had no say in that. It was, yeah, it was not a good thing. And everybody I've ever talked to is like, what the heck happened with that guy? Why? It's like, yeah, we understand. We're right there with you. So yeah, unfortunately, it is what it is. But nobody was happy with the result.
Oh my god! So that's another example of to tie it back in with what you're talking about with Midway of a developer kind of overstepping their hand a little bit. Midway thing I could understand. It sucks for the guide, but I understand from a business perspective.
Sure.
And as much as I understand the play online thing from a business perspective, it makes no like just the act of having to like if you think about that in a very literal fashion, I'm going to read a book like, okay, let me read this strategy guide that I'm supposed to be playing this game for in front of my computer because it's
Right.
not like we had smartphones back then. And so that way I could go and find out more about this game. And also, if you think about it, a lot of the time back then, there was a lot of family computers. So it's not like the computer would have been in the same room as the the game system usually, I would say.
Right.
So even in an optimal situation, it's not a good idea. But now you throw into the mix of just like it's not like we have a smartphone in our pocket to go to use the keyword Garn two
Right.
to look up Garnett's like stats.
Yeah, no, and everybody was about portals back then. Everybody was trying to create this launching point where people would log into every day before they went out to the rest of the web. Portal, portal, portal. Even my publisher was trying to do that in some of their imprints. They were going to create a portal where people would go to and get their basic news and everything else, and that's just what Square wanted to do too at the time. And yeah, I don't think play online's a thing anymore.
The
So,
it is in the sense that you needed to log on to Final Fantasy XI from what I've heard.
sure.
But it's not real like the site for the Final Fantasy IX guide, I'm pretty sure is just non existent anymore.
I
Um,
would imagine that, yeah.
Now I gotta ask, what did you all push back on Square? Like, did you try to push back, or was it one of those things where it's just what they say is what went? Like, you couldn't there, it wasn't worth trying to push.
You always push. You have to push. I mean, you have to fight for your product and you have to fight for what you think is going to be right. And when they tell you something like that, when they say, okay, we want you to do this, and you know that that's the wrong decision, that it's going to hurt your sales,
Hmm.
because you're paying a lot of money for those licenses. I
Yeah.
mean, a lot of money. Because you got to figure strategy guides were like when we first started doing them, they were like $7.99, $9.99, $11.99, somewhere in there. Um, but these licenses were $100,000, $200,000, things like that.
Jeez.
So you had to sell a lot of them in
Yeah.
order to make money. Um, and so yeah, if they're telling you to do something and you know that's going to hurt sales, you've got to push back. But there are times where eventually you just have to say, okay, we've just got to get this guide out. Um, because if you're not willing to do it, the competitor probably will be willing to do it
Mhm.
just to steal that license from you. So, and again, Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII had been huge for us. So
Yeah. I mean, number seven was the number one selling. It's advertised as the number one selling guide for at least a while. I
it
don't.
was
I don't know
huge.
if. I don't know if it ever got dethroned, but now that, not to jump around too much, because it's one of the things. There's so many things I want to ask. I'm trying to get to as many of them as I can. But you were in talking about, like, uh writing the guys, you mentioned Dan kind of got the short end of the stick on that one, but when you wrote guides, how much of it was collaborative with the other writers working at Brady Games or Prima Guides or anything like that? I know when you, like you said before, when you started out, it was just you at the beginning, but as the company grew, how much did the writers collaborate with each other on individual guides?
With things like JRPGs, it became very necessary just
Hmm.
because of the amount of information. I For Final Fantasy 12, I think we had 3 or 4 people who were writing it, and we had one person whose main focus was the main story, and then one person who was focusing on putting all the lists together, and then another person who was trying to find all the side quest stuff and break that down. So it became more collaborative based on the size of the game, but there were still some that it made sense to have a single author. It just really depended. Um, like I worked on Titan Quest, and that was one where it would have been helpful to have another author, uh, but it was just me.
Well, and now, was it just you on Final Fantasy VIII as well?
Yes.
You poor son of a bitch! Oh my god, that, like, because I love Final Fantasy VIII. I am a little bit of, I have a soft spot for it, like I mentioned at the beginning of the episode. The process for writing that, one, because you said you had 30 days for Final Seven. How long did you have for eight?
We had a little longer with 8, but still, it was probably like 45 days. So
That's still
it's
not a lot of time.
no, because it still came out in Japan before it came out here. So again, we were able to get some materials from Japan, but we didn't have any way to easily translate them. I think we hired a translator to do a little bit, but what we got back, um, the translator didn't know the product. So
Okay.
a lot of the translation didn't make sense because he didn't know what they were talking about.
That context would definitely be important for a game
Right.
when you're translating, especially a text heavy game like a JRPG.
Google
Uh,
Translate would have been awesome to have.
oh my god, I believe it. Um, with something I was thinking about, I meant to bring it up a little bit ago when you're talking about when pushing back on developers, and, like, because you want to make sure you can make the best possible product for the sales. Was there a very tangible, like a noticeable difference pre FF7 and post FF7 in terms of the guide's business from Brady? Like, did it, like, I'm assuming, like, we know you said it yourself, the guide did well, but how much of a difference did you notice pre and post FF7?
That's a good question. There were a lot of JRPGs coming out around that time, and the success of Final Fantasy VII allowed Brady to explore more of that. Because again, like I
Hmm.
said, they didn't want to do those. They were convinced that the American market doesn't like Japanese RPGs, so they're not going to buy our guides. And I was trying very hard to tell them, listen, these are the games that need the guides. These are big games. There's a lot hidden in them. They can be very difficult to get through. Um, a lot of people want to play them, but they don't want to listen to every line in the story. So they need somebody to hold their hand. And unfortunately, that's a big part of our guides. We have a lot of people who would just buy the guide, follow it to the end of the game, and be done with it. Um, but that really helped us a lot because it allowed us to explore some of those Japanese titles and really kind of open up to a lot more. Plus, you had a lot of shooters and things coming out that expanded. Like
Hmm.
that was back when Quake was coming out, um, Doom, and all this, and those as well were also huge for us.
When writing, what was your favorite type of guide to write? I mean, I know JRPGs were obviously the most time consuming, so I don't. I'd be curious. Did you enjoy writing those, or were they so much hell that it's like it's hard to look back on it now?
I loved writing those guides, even though it was difficult.
Hmm.
Um, just because I was such a fan of Square and of like Dragon Warrior. No, you know, being able to work on something like that was unexpected. So even though it was difficult, it was the kind of thing where every day I'm like, I can't believe I'm doing this.
Yeah.
You know, so that gave me a lot of fuel just because I felt very privileged to even have the opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
And there was that period where Square was getting kind of experimental and doing things like Chocobo Racing, Einhander and things like that, that
Hmm. Hmm.
I also had the opportunity to look at and work on occasionally. And Front Mission 3 was one that I got to work on that I really enjoyed too. But there were times where some of the games were more of a chore than a joy. Um, but those were fairly limited. And there were only a few that I went through where I'm like, oh, I don't want to have to play this game again today. um, but I also, because of that, I also got some cool experiences though. Like I got to go out to Nintendo to work on Golden Sun 1 and 2. And
Oh, okay.
because we got to do that, I got to go out there and live out of a hotel for a week, but got to go in every day to sit in Nintendo and work on a strategy guide.
Was it Nintendo of Japan or Nintendo of America?
America, so we were out in
Okay.
Redmond.
Okay.
There was also, I got back when Westwood Studios was still around.
Mm.
I got to go out there to work on Blade Runner,
Oh,
and
okay.
yeah, that was super cool. So they actually that was really cool because they actually stuck us in the room with all of their testers. So we were
Oh.
sitting shoulder to shoulder with all of these guys who were just doing the same thing we were doing, which was just playing the games over and
Hmm.
over and over, trying to find the bugs in that. And two of us got to sit in there and just kind of be with them and play the game, until we got the guide done, because they didn't want to let us leave with it because they were protecting their betas pretty carefully. Um, but it was cool because we got to know a lot of the people, at Westwood. We got to know people from Blizzard, got to know some of the people out at Square, and they became friends, and I don't know. It was an amazing time.
That sounds awesome. Like that's super cool to me because it's one of those things where it's like getting to be it's such an like a I don't like such a big part of the game history and the games industry for such a like at least like 2 decades
Yeah,
where just strategy guides maybe a decade and a half but it's still like the strategy guides were huge and I was just that's fascinating to see how it started out where you had no input from anybody and you just have to figure it out and by the end you're meeting with play testers for the games that you're going to be uh, writing guides for. That's really cool.
yeah. I mean, when we were first calling up companies trying to get licenses, a lot of them just didn't understand even what we were trying to do. So, I
Really?
mean, it changed over the years because then we became more of like an essential marketing tool to them. So
Hmm.
it got to the point where they, like, if they had a big title coming out, they would say, yeah, we'll give you the license to this, but as part of the license to this, you also have to do a guide for this, C title, just to help us get some promotion. So there are guides out there for some games where I'm sure people scratch their heads and go, why would they want to do that? But
Yeah.
there were times where we just had to because it was part of the deal.
how much were you involved with the decision making? Because it sounds like since you were in the ground floor with Brady, and the way you've been talking about it, it seems like you had a little bit of a say. But just how much of a say did you have? Like, were you a higher up in the games division, I guess, for lack of this, the strategy guide division, or were you kind of just like what I guess what was your title there?
I I was a grunt, but I was the grunt who knew the games, so I got more input than I probably should have. Um,
Okay.
just because I could look at something and say this is going to be good or this is not going to be good. Like Tomb Raider, the first time we went to, I think it was CES, not E3, but we went to CES and we're walking the floor looking for titles, and this was back when Eidos was nothing, and
Mm-hmm.
they had Tomb Raider on a single monitor, just a tiny little monitor, and it was playing through. And we looked at this and we're like, wow, that's really cool looking. So we got to go, back and give this report and say, hey guys, I know this is a company we've never heard of and everything else, but we need to look at this game because it looks really sharp. Um, so we got to have him, input like that. I actually nearly got myself fired one time because my publisher was pushing really hard to do a particular title. Um, and we had to sit down at a meeting. And in the middle of the meeting, he just out of the blue asked me, he goes, why don't you tell them why it is we should be doing this particular book? And I was young and naive, and I sat there for a second. I looked at him and I said, I don't think we should be doing
What game
this.
was it?
um,
Or if you don't feel comfortable saying, I don't want to put you on the
no,
spot,
it's
but
fine. It was Bubsy 1 and 2. It was a companion of Bubsy 1 and 2. And I just felt like for us, I don't have a problem with the Bubsy games, but I felt for us, it was probably not the wisest use of our time because it wasn't going to be something that was going to sell enough guides to be profitable. Um, so here we're doing this compendium of the two games, which sounds like a great deal. If you
hmm
don't know the games industry, hey, two games, one book, platformers, it's like Mario. This is going to be great. Um, but me as a gamer looking at it, I was like, no, this,
like Mario's a hell of a stretch for Bubsy.
yeah. And I was just like, this just isn't gonna, it's not gonna work. And it didn't. But yeah, I nearly got myself fired just because yeah, I was way too honest in the middle of a board meeting with my boss's superiors.
Oh, that's funny. Well, good thing you didn't get fired because you brought them Final Fantasy VII,
Yes.
and it worked out for the best for all parties concerned with that.
Yep.
Um, I would have asked Luigi's my buddy Luigi's apartment asked when did you get a game in comparison to when it released. We already kind of talked about that, but I wanted to shout out Luigi at the very least because his
Sure.
questions all got answered, but I wanted to shout him out because he did ask them. So that was him. Try that I mentioned before from My Life in Gaming. Just asked so many really good questions. Um, did you ever, when you were writing a guide for a game, did you ever? I know you would get pushback from devs about what you could and could not include, but did you ever get like feedback from developers where it's like you wrote the guide in one way and it was against the way they had originally thought the game should be played? Was there any situations like that?
Um, Not that I can really think of. I mean, they, most of the time they weren't that involved. I know, again, as a gamer, it seems like that would be something they would want input in, but generally they did not. Um, we were pretty much on our own when it came to all of that. They wanted to make sure that we represented their product well, and that we didn't do anything with their characters that they would rather not have happened. But when it came to the actual strategy, now they left that pretty much up to us.
Okay, okay. Uh, in terms, and and speaking of strategy, did you have a strategy for some of the larger games of how to deduce like enemies' weaknesses or like basically the information from the game? Because uh, like you were saying, you didn't really have any input from the devs, so you had. I would assume you had to figure out some type of system. This is another question from Try. Just like, did you come up with a process for deducing things in games, like whether it's enemy weaknesses or whatnot? Because he specifically cited the stuff in Final Fantasy VIII with like the cards and how you would, which enemies would let you draw which things, the magic
Mhm.
from that. Like, did you have a process of figuring this type of stuff out when there was no help given to you?
Trial and error. I mean, just absolute trial and error. That was one of the things where having the Japanese guide was a little helpful because even though I couldn't read it, um, I could look at it and see they've got three things here. So I knew to keep trying because I only had two. Um,
Okay.
things like that. So that was something that did help out, even if I couldn't read it, because I at least knew there was some other thing to try and get. Um, but a lot of it was pure just doing it again and again and again
Yeah.
until something came up. So yeah, but I mean that's why they gave us the guides because it was probably more help than what their developers could give us. Especially when a game was made in Japan,
Hmm.
the American unit is just there to do the conversion.
Hmm.
So they're not intimately familiar with the game itself. Um, so they wouldn't be able to sit down with us and say, "Yeah, you should do X and Y, and to beat this boss, you want to use this thing." They just didn't have that information.
That's crazy. I think just what I keep, the reason I keep bringing it back up is I'm just consistently, just genuinely shocked at how little information you were given for the FF7 and FF8 guides. And were you given more as like the guides kind of took off? Like, did you start getting more information from developers about like inside scoops about the games as time went on?
Nope,
No, no. Okay.
nope, never. They just this. I mean, this is an understandable perspective. They are busy trying to get that game to gold so that they
Yep.
can put it out. So their developers' resources are very valuable to them, and what we're doing is much less so. They want the book to come out for the advertising and to be this companion product. But when we give them the check, when they say, "Hey, yeah, we want $100,000 for this license," we give them that $100,000. They're like, "Okay, we're good. Good luck with your book." Um, Other than that, really, we would just go to them, give them the text, give them the pages before they print and say, "Hey, here's what we're going to do." They would look at it more from a licensing perspective, make sure that it fit their voice.
Hmm.
But whether they actually sat down and read the text line by line, I doubt it. Um, it's just that wasn't their primary concern, at least certainly not with the bigger companies. I think some of the littler companies, like today, when you have a lot of very small, like take Stardew Valley, if we were to do a guide on that,
Yeah.
I would not be surprised if there would be a lot more input from the developer because he loves his product and I think he'd be very protective of it.
Hmm.
Uh, but that's a very different situation, much more intimate when you're dealing with somebody who's huge, like a Capcom or Namco or Square, something like that. It's there are so many people working on those things
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
there's not one person who's really assigned to a task like that, other than the people in marketing, and the people in marketing aren't necessarily super familiar with the game.
That I could understand that. I could understand. It's disappointing, and I feel I'm empathetic towards you hearing the lack of information that you had to go off of. Like, because I'm just trying to picture even like I don't think I'd be creative enough to like or have the motivation to do that. So that's crazy.
It helped to be it helped to be kind of a perfectionist
Mm,
because I was a completionist to begin with. I grew up not having much money, so I had an Atari 2600 in like six games, and I would play those games again and again and again and try to find absolutely everything in them. When I finally got enough money from mowing yards to buy my 8-bit Nintendo, um, I had Mario Brothers, and I played that game over and over and over, and would speed run it, until I could beat it in 8 minutes. And so, I already had this mindset going into it that I want to get as much out of these games as I can. Um, and I was so used to doing that sitting down with something like Final Fantasy VII and just trying to milk every bit of content out of it didn't feel foreign.
It was
That
you were already
that
naturally predisposed to it, kind of.
Right, and I still sort of am. Even it took me honestly, it took me years to get out of the mindset of playing it like I was writing a guide for it. Um, I struggled for a little while just because I would still sit down and I'm thinking about, okay, what would be the best way to do this instead of just sitting there and playing and enjoying it.
Well,
So,
and that actually kind of leads into a question from Parallax Puddles that I mentioned before, and now I'm getting back to. Did writing strategy guides ruin the magic of the game for you? Like, whichever game you were writing for, did it ruin the magic of it?
not necessarily. I would say Final Fantasy VII is tough because I wrote that guide, but then I rewrote that guide when the PC version came out.
Okay.
Um, and by that time, I had learned so much, and I had realized a lot of the mistakes I made when I first wrote the guide. That I went into it, and I basically told them, I'm like, I sat down with my team, and I said, I'd like to rewrite this. So the Final Fantasy VII PC guide is actually very different from the console guide because
Mm.
I rewrote the entire thing. But by the time I had done it and revised it as we did new editions of it and then done the PC guide, I was so burnt out on Final Fantasy VII. I have never replayed that game
I can
because
understand.
I can't. I mean, I have tried. Even the new version has come out, and I want to play it. There is a part of me that so badly wants to play it, but there's
Hmm.
another part of me that just cannot do it. So I've got it. I own it. I just have not played
I don't blame you. It's almost like a PTSD type of thing.
it.
You
Kind of
went through it for
is.
so long. Um, another uh another question from Try. How do you feel about some of your books becoming sought after by collectors? That strategy guides are almost a collector's piece now.
Oh, I think that's awesome. I think it's cool that people are out there collecting them because I think they are great collectors material. I've got my own collection, but that's more of a just kind of personal me hoarding the stuff that I worked on.
Hmm.
But some of them, like especially here in the later years, some of them just became so cool with the hardbound editions and some of the things that they were able to do in the later years. I look at them, I'm like, wow, these things are amazing. Like I've got a Skyrim book sitting here next to me that I just think is amazing to look at, even without using. It's just such a cool collector's piece. I think it's very, very neat.
That's
And the
cool.
fact that people are out there, collecting our guides, it's it's nice to know that people enjoyed what we did, because ultimately that's all we wanted to do. Because I'm a gamer at heart. I love the games, and I wanted to be able to help people. So whenever I hear, "Hey, I had your guide. It helped me a lot. I really liked it." Um, that's special because that means that what I did was worthwhile.
It absolutely was, man. It absolutely was. Like I said, I carried that with me every day for at least a couple months in like eighth or ninth grade or something like that. I credit your guide with, Final Fantasy VIII in retrospect is kind of a polarizing thing in the Final Fantasy community. Some people love it, some people hate it.
Sure,
I fell in love with that game. I think because your guide removed a lot of the rough edges of
sure.
of that game for me, and I kind of credit your guide for my love of that game. And actually, and speaking of guides, once again, for yourself, do you prefer to play games with a guide or without a guide? I would assume without because you spent so many years writing, but maybe I don't know. Maybe do you use guides at all in your own personal life outside of writing? Well, outside of when you wrote guides and whatnot.
Very, 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 very rarely. It's more when I pick up a guide, um, it's very much looking at it to see what how they did it.
Mm,
Because I'm mainly curious to see how the process has improved over the years and to look at like, okay, what are they able to do now that the tools are better? Um, and I marveled at some of the guides that they were putting out at the end because what they've done now is just so incredible. It stinks that they're gone because the products that they were putting out were just so much better than we were able to put out at the beginning. Um,
hmm
and it's just some of the things that they were doing are incredible. Like when they would take a screenshot and be able to put, very specific arrows that kind of show exactly where to go and seem to be a part of the screenshot rather than, this very foreign thing that's just kind of been stamped on top of it. I would look at that and I'm just like, wow, I wish we could have done that with Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII.
hmm
It's but yeah, personally, when I play a game, I don't tend to use guides, but I didn't use them before, which also makes it kind of funny that I was brought into this to say, hey, how should we make these guides? But I felt I knew when I was talking to my friends and we would sit down and talk, like my friend David Waybright, who was also a publisher at Brady. I remember we were playing Day of the Tentacle,
hmm
on PC, and we would sit there and just call each other on the phone and say, "Hey, have you gotten past this particular puzzle?" And, we would just go back and forth because, I'd get stuck at one point or he'd get stuck at another, and we just share that information back and forth. So just from doing that, I still kind of had an idea what people needed. But I think it's more fun to sit there and just chat with people. Like, okay, I'm stuck here. Can you give me a tip?
Now, in talking about writing though, and talking about writing the guides and whatnot, how did you find your own style? Because like, did you write guides or otherwise? Did you write books or anything, or like, did you like to write before starting writing guides, or was it something that since you kind of fell into, that's kind of how you first got started, and how did you kind of find your own style from there?
I wrote basically how I talked.
Hmm
Which was not the best way to write, but fortunately, I had a very good editor at the time named Tim Cox.
hmm
And Tim was a great guy. Tim was a super great guy. He was kind of a video game player, but not super into video games. Uh, but he was an excellent editor. And what I did was, as I wrote, I would come up with a guide, and then I would go to him, sit down with the chapter, and I would say, "Hey, Tim, I know this isn't the best writing. I know
hmm
I'm not a writer. How can I make your job easier on the next chapter?" And I would say, tell me what I did. What are the mistakes I made consistently? How can I improve? And he would go through with me and show me some of the common mistakes that I made. Um, Sometimes technical things that wouldn't mean anything to you guys, but as far as in the process of writing a guide, we would have to code the text so that it laid out properly.
Okay.
He would show me tricks like that too, just to make sure that I was setting up the document properly. But a lot of it, we just sat down and talked about, grammatically, you could do this better. And I've always been fairly expressive when it comes to writing things like that. I always
hmm
enjoyed creative assignments. So even though I wasn't much of a writer, it felt natural to go in there and write something and try to talk about it and make it sound like, oh, this is super cool, because I thought it was super cool. So I wanted to express that when I was writing something.
Yeah.
So the yeah, it was mainly just being really open to feedback and seeking that out and not just sitting on what I had. You have to want to grow.
I only have one last question for you before
Sure.
I actually have a few questions, but like I have one last question about guides, and I have a few questions kind of related to guides, but just gaming in general. So one last question from Try. Um, I know you weren't able to understand the story of FF7 when you first played it, or even FF8 originally. But as you're playing through the games, were you able to enjoy the stories that you were able to actually read and understand, or were they spoiled for you by information received prior? Like, were you able to enjoy the story the first time or so when you played through it?
Yeah, I always played through the game quickly the first time, but kind of just experienced it. Because going through and experiencing the game like that made it easier for me to understand what I wanted to ultimately create. Um,
Okay. Hmm.
because I think if you don't go through and experience it like everyone else at least once, it's hard to know what to do with that product.
Okay. Yeah.
You can't, you have to understand what the challenges someone's going to face. Because if
You
you
need to
don't,
meet the audience where they're at, because
right,
if
exactly,
you if you're right, it's the same. It's the idea of, like a game developer watching someone struggle with a section, be like, what are you talking about, that's so easy. It's because they are so close to the product. Of course it's easy for them, they made it. So
right,
if you're not meeting the audience where they're at, same idea with the guides. Like, if you're playing a game for the first time, what would be the things you're looking for? So
right.
that's a good, I like that. Sorry, continue, I didn't mean to cut you
No,
off.
it's fine. That also gave me an opportunity to go ahead and record my gameplay. Um, so I would have hours upon hours of VHS tapes um, that I could go back through and look at later and see, okay, what was it I did here? What was it, that I struggled with? Things like that. Plus, I would have all my save games I could jump around with.
I getcha. That makes sense. That makes sense. So, one last question related to guides, and then some gaming stuff, real quick, and I'll let you go. What got you out of guide writing? Like, was it just burnout? Was it like just something where you found a better job? Like, what kind of got you out of writing guides in the mid 2000s?
Um, it was medical. Just
Okay,
it's very, very hard on the body because of the hours you have to put in and
I
everything
believe it.
else. And I just kind of, excuse me, I just got to a point where it was no longer possible for me to put in like those 16-hour days and just go full throttle for months at a time. The problem with the guide business is it moves with the industry. So as you know, there are
Yeah.
very specific times when you have the big releases.
Hmm.
Um, the end of the year is absolutely nuts. So, the fall and winter, things would be absolutely insane. And then spring comes around and there's a huge lull
Hmm.
um, because everybody's waiting for that brief sort of summer push when they're trying to get games out there for kids who are going to be out of school and things like that. But then all the big titles are typically saved until it's time for, okay, let's get this stuff out so it's available um, for Christmas. So you'd have like 6 months where it's just go, 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 go. 6 months of working every single day, long hours, um, without a break. And then suddenly you've got 2 months off. You know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's just, it is, it is a really great career for someone who does not have a family. Um, it is not a great career for somebody who has kids. And by that time I had kids.
I can understand. Yeah, I get it. I
So
get it.
my daughter was born in 2001, and it was probably 2 years later that I was out. So,
I don't blame you for that in the slightest. I don't think I would be able to. Like, it's 16-hour days. That's crazy.
it was
That's bonkers. So, not guides related, but I saw on your Threads account, which is how I first got in contact with you, that you are a DM, and I also mentioned, I think, I don't know, if I don't remember if it was on or off mic, but we first interacted because I was posting about D&D, and you liked one of the things. So I take it you are an avid D&D player.
I am play every week.
That is awesome. How long have you been playing for? I know it has nothing to do with guides, but I've been recently getting back into D&D, so I take any chance I can get to talk it a little bit.
I've been playing actively for about 3 years, but it is it is something I had an interest in when I was a teenager,
Hmm.
but could just never find people to play with. And then over the years, I had occasionally found friends who played, and I wanted to get into it, but it just could never quite get anything going.
Hmm.
Um, and then just recently I did one of those things where my wife was interested in it too. So we had gotten together with a group through a gaming store and started playing just with a random group of people. And now I'm just kind of actively involved with kind of a growing group of people who are interested in playing D&D, and so we do it all the time now. I've
That's
got
awesome.
3 games going simultaneously now.
Wow. Now, do you DM or do you play or both?
Both. It just depends on the situation. Like I run one game, but we kind of swap out because we don't want to have a forever DM.
Mm,
So we have. I kind of took over with the latest campaign because we've got one guy who really likes to be the DM, but I was like, hey, I've DM'd some. I'm willing to do this, so you can take a break. So he's allowing me to do that.
nice.
But he's been a DM for like 12 years, so I feel a little out of my league. But
Now, the one last D&D related question, and we'll do some wrap ups here. Has your guide writing helped with D&D in any way, shape, or form? I know it's a bizarre question, but just out of curiosity.
when I'm sitting down taking my notes and everything and trying to kind of figure things out, yeah, I do a bit. The only thing with DMing versus writing a strategy guide is with strategy guide the content's already there, so
Hmm.
you're just kind of pulling it out and writing about it. Whereas with DMing something, they give you a tiny bit of information, then I expect you to take that and expand upon it and really turn it into a story. So
Hmm.
there's a lot more creativity in that.
I've tried DMing once and I got too anxious, so I can only imagine.
Oh yeah,
It's nuts. But all right, well, we're gonna wrap up this interview. David, thank you once again for joining me, man. This was awesome. My final questions for you is one. There's a podcast I like from Alan Alda called Clear and Vivid, which is all about the science of communication and whatnot. But he always ends his interviews with 8 different questions. I'm not going to ask all 8. I only pick one that I really like, and I haven't asked this one in a while. What do you wish you really understood?
what do I wish I really understood? The stock market would be nice.
That is fair.
I
Bunch
wish
of
I understood
fucking
that.
rich people making betting money on non-existent dollars.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd like to understand that a lot better.
I totally get that. I totally get that. Yeah, that's one of my favorite questions because everyone takes it so differently. Like I went with music theory. I've had other people say, "I wish I understood," like life, or I wish I understood, like something very philosophical and introspective. So, and everyone has such a different answer. I was like, I just want to know music theory, dude. Like that would be great.
That would be great too. But yeah, no, I would have to say I wish that when I was, you know, when I was in my 20s, that I knew how to invest better.
Well, I still have yet to invest. Anyway, well, that's neither here nor there. So my final question is questions from Courtney. Da 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 da. Questions from Courtney. Courtney's my wife, and she knows nothing about gaming, nerd culture, geek culture, whatever you want to call it. She knows nothing about it. So I always like to
Excellent.
ask her to send me a question for my guest, something that maybe they would not have expected or I would have come up with. So she sent me 2 actually, and I like this one more. Can you describe your favorite childhood toy?
My favorite childhood toy. That is a tough one. I think that would have been my green machine,
Okay.
which basically was a big wheel,
Mm.
um, except that it was longer and you controlled it with 2 different sticks on the sides of it.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my
So you kind
gosh,
of,
it's been a while since I've seen one of these.
yeah, you kind of laying down, and then you've got sticks on the side that turn the back wheels. Um, so you don't have like a traditional steering wheel at all. But man, that thing was so much fun, and I could spin that thing out. If I would love to still have that. I need an adult version of that.
I mean, it feels like a motorcycle for kids in a good
Yes,
way. You know, I could
yes.
totally like that. That would have been right up my alley. If I like, I remember seeing it, but my parents couldn't really afford anything like that. So that's
I
awesome, though.
I've always been a thrill seeker, and that thing brought a lot of thrills.
I believe it. I believe it. Well, that will do it for this episode, y'all. Thank you all for listening. Shout outs once again to the people who wrote in for questions. Try from My Life in Gaming, Parallax Puddles, Mass Keaton, and Luigi's Apartment. Thank you all for writing in questions for David. And David, thank you once again for joining me. Where, if you are to be found online, where can the good people find you? And is there anything you'd like to promote?
I am really just on Threads right now. As far as promotion goes, now I don't have anything in particular. I would love to see even more women getting into gaming.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big thing for me. I have two daughters, and they're both gamers, and I would love to see more and more women getting into it and kind of taking that over. But people
Absolutely.
can find me on Threads if they have more questions. They're welcome to come ask.
That and he is at DA Cassady. That's Cassady over on Threads. So go check him out over there. As usual, for myself, you can follow me on Facebook, Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, at Still Pod, at all those locations. I also stream usually twice a week, usually Tuesdays and Saturdays if I'm not tired or doing other stuff, at Still Pod over on Twitch. If you want to support the show, though, you can do so in a number of ways. You can give it a 5-star rating or review on whichever podcasting app you use, because it does help people find the show. You know, whatever the algorithm shenanigans happens, it pushes it out to more people, and it only takes you a little bit of time, and it makes me feel warm and fuzzy, and I like feeling warm and fuzzy. So that's takes a moment of your time. If you want to support it monetarily, there is a patreon.com/stillloadingpod. For $1 a month, you get all the episodes a little bit earlier with better audio quality, as well as access to patron voting rights, which help guide the direction of the show. I do quarterly polls that my patrons pick a game for me to cover on the show. And then at the beginning of the year, I do a big backlog month poll where I put 16 games up from my backlog, and the top 4 in terms of votes will get chosen, and I cover them usually in October of that year. And so there's at the time this episode comes out, that poll is over, and there's 4 games coming out in October that are 4 episodes on 4 different games, which I'm looking forward to. In fact, crazily enough, David, one of them is Golden Sun.
Sweet.
So there we go. So that's a kind of a that I did not plan that out, listeners. It just kind of worked out really nicely. That's all at the $1 level. For there's a $3 level. You get everything I mentioned prior at the 1, plus access to patron shoutouts, which you heard at the beginning of this episode. For $4 a month, you get everything I mentioned previously, plus 2 mini bonus episodes. And for $5 a month, you get all of that, plus my monthly movie podcast, which at the time is going on, at the time this episode releases, is my Still Family show, which is my monthly Fast and Furious movie podcast, where all the guests who join me aren't just friends, they're family. And that's all over at patreon.com/stillloadingpod. But that's it. That is the end of my long plugs. I need to find a way to truncate those things, but that's all the time I got for you. David, man, thank you once again for joining me.
No, thank you, Josh. Thanks for having me on.
And with all that said, listeners, I will see you all next time.